Chapter 1. The Whispering Walls. Nestled in the heart of a city forgotten by progress, the library stood as a monument to the past. Its Gothic spires pierced the overcast sky, and its stained glass windows glimmered dully in the waning afternoon light. The building was massive, its facade adorned with intricate carvings of mythical beasts, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Few people entered its doors anymore. The once bustling institution had become a relic, its halls filled more with silence than seekers of knowledge. Emma Voss had always been drawn to quiet places. A recent graduate of archival sciences, she sought solace in the dusty corners of libraries and museums. When she received the offer to oversee the archives of the city's ancient library, she accepted without hesitation, eager to escape the suffocating noise of modern life. It was the perfect retreat, or so she thought. Her first day began like any other job. The head librarian, a frail woman whose name Emma could not recall even hours later, handed her a ring of brass keys and gestured toward the lower levels of the library. The archives were her domain now, she explained with a voice like dry parchment. Emma nodded politely, suppressing her excitement as she descended the spiraling staircase into the bowels of the building. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of aged paper and mildew thickening like a fog. The archives were vast. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched endlessly, filled with books, scrolls, and artifacts. The lighting was sparse, provided by flickering sconces mounted on the stone walls, casting dancing shadows across the room. Emma's footsteps echoed loudly, their sound swallowed by the oppressive stillness. As she began to explore, Emma noticed the peculiar architecture of the space. The walls were not smooth like the upper floors, but covered in ornate engravings. Tiny, spiraling patterns twisted into faces, symbols, and what appeared to be words in a language she couldn't recognize. Running her fingers over the carvings, she felt a strange warmth emanating from the stone, as though it retained the heat of a long-dead fire. Hours passed as she immersed herself in the task of cataloging. Some books crumbled at her touch, their contents lost to time, while others seemed eerily pristine. One particular volume caught her attention, a leather-bound tome with no title or markings on its cover. The leather was cracked but oddly supple, and the faint scent of iron wafted from it. She set it aside for later, feeling a curious weight settle in her chest. As the day drew to a close, Emma began to notice something strange. The faintest whispers tickled the edge of her hearing, so soft that she questioned whether they were real. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, rising and falling like a distant conversation. She paused, straining to listen, but the whispers faded the moment she focused on them. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as the tricks of a tired mind and continued working. It wasn't until she was locking up for the night that she saw it. At the far end of the room, where the light barely reached, a shadow moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably real. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she froze, staring into the gloom. Her rational mind told her it was nothing, a trick of the flickering light, a stray thought manifesting in the dark. But her instinct screamed otherwise. Emma took a tentative step forward, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The shadow didn't move. As she neared the spot, she realized there was nothing there, just a wall, blank and unremarkable. Letting out a shaky breath, she turned back toward the staircase, eager to leave the oppressive atmosphere of the archives behind. But as she ascended, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to follow her, growing more distinct with every step. Words she couldn't understand filled her ears, layered and overlapping in a cacophony that made her head throb. By the time she reached the main floor, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. That night, Emma lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the unmarked book rested on her bedside table, its presence a quiet intrusion in her thoughts. She hadn't meant to take it home. Somehow, it had ended up in her bag, as though it had chosen to accompany her. The thought was absurd, but as sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of the walls whispering her name. Unbeknownst to Emma, the archive had already begun its work. Chapter 2: Shadows Between the Shelves. The following morning, a pale light filtered through the high-arched windows of the library, painting the interior in hues of gray and gold. Emma arrived early, her coffee cup steaming in the chill of the building's entryway. She hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the staircase that led to the archives below. The strange events of the previous day lingered at the edge of her thoughts, yet she rationalized them away as the effects of fatigue and overstimulation in a new environment. Descending the staircase felt different this time. The air seemed heavier, pressing down on her shoulders like an unseen weight. As her shoes clicked against the stone steps, she noticed a faint vibration beneath her feet, as though the library itself had a pulse. Reaching the bottom, she flipped the light switch, bathing the archives in the same dim, flickering glow as before. The shelves stood like ancient sentinels, their countless rows stretching into darkness. Emma had always found comfort in the company of books, but here, the silence felt intrusive, almost accusatory. She busied herself with organizing the scattered stacks she had left behind the previous day, trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere. Yet, as she worked, the uncanny sensation of being watched crept over her. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia. It wasn't until she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye that her unease solidified into fear. She spun around, her heart racing, but the aisle behind her was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's ancient ventilation system. She scolded herself inwardly and returned to her work, though her hands trembled slightly as she placed books back on the shelves. Hours passed, the whispers beginning once again in the background of her consciousness. They ebbed and flowed, sometimes no louder than the rustle of pages, other times nearly distinguishable. Emma tried to tune them out, but they seemed to grow more insistent with each passing moment. By mid-afternoon, her curiosity got the better of her. She approached one of the engraved walls, running her fingers over the intricate designs. The carvings seemed to shift under her touch, rearranging into patterns her mind couldn't quite grasp. The warmth from the stone was still there, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. She pressed her ear against the wall, half expecting to hear the whispers more clearly. What she heard instead chilled her to the bone. It was a deep, guttural sound, like the slow creak of a massive door opening in a distant void. Pulling back abruptly, Emma stared at the wall, her pulse racing. The sound had felt alive, sentient in a way she couldn't explain. Turning away, she caught sight of the unmarked book she had brought back the previous night. She had placed it on a nearby desk, but had not yet dared to open it. Now, it seemed to call to her, its presence magnetic and suffocating. She approached the desk cautiously, her gaze locked on the tome as though it might spring to life. Emma hesitated, her fingers hovering over the cracked leather cover. Taking a deep breath, she opened the book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the ink was as dark as fresh blood. The text was written in a language she didn't recognize, its characters jagged and angular, almost violent in their form. One page stood out among the others, its surface covered not in writing but in an illustration. It depicted a massive figure standing in the center of what appeared to be the archives. The figure's face was obscured, but its elongated limbs and hunched posture gave it an aura of predatory menace. Around the figure, smaller shapes knelt in supplication, their forms twisted and incomplete. As Emma stared at the image, a sudden wave of dizziness overcame her. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows between the shelves deepening into inky blackness. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, her breath coming in short gasps. The whispers surged, louder and more distinct than ever. She could almost make out words, commands, warnings, or pleas. She couldn't tell. When the dizziness passed, Emma realized the light in the room had dimmed considerably. Checking her watch, she saw that it was still early, yet the archives felt as though they were submerged in twilight. She retrieved her phone from her pocket to use its flashlight, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. The battery was dead, though she had charged it fully that morning. Panic began to claw at the edges of her mind as she turned toward the staircase. The shadows between the shelves seemed to ripple and shift, as though alive. Her steps quickened, the feeling of being watched growing unbearable. She could almost feel unseen eyes tracking her movements, their gaze cold and calculating. Reaching the staircase, Emma glanced back one last time. In the dim light, she thought she saw a figure standing at the far end of the room, its outline barely discernible against the darkness. It didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. She fled up the stairs, her breath hitching as she burst into the main library. The bright sunlight streaming through the windows felt like a lifeline, anchoring her to reality. Yet, even as she stood there, her heart pounding, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching, waiting for her to return. That night, the unmarked book sat on her bedside table once more, its pages untouched. Emma lay awake for hours, haunted by the whispers that refused to leave her mind. Somewhere, deep in the archives, the shadows stirred. Chapter 3. The Key to Silence. Morning broke with a heavy fog blanketing the city, muffling the sounds of the world outside. Emma stood by her window, staring out at the shapeless gray, her mind restless. The events of the previous day had left an indelible mark on her thoughts, and sleep had been a fleeting visitor in the long hours of the night. The unmarked book remained unopened on her bedside table, an object she could neither discard nor confront. By the time she arrived at the library, the fog had crept into every corner of the streets, wrapping around the building like a spectral shroud. She hesitated at the entrance, her keys dangling from her fingers, before forcing herself to push the heavy wooden doors open. Inside, the silence enveloped her like a second skin, oppressive and suffocating. The archives waited below, their presence a palpable weight beneath her feet. Emma descended the staircase slowly, each step echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness. When she reached the bottom, she paused, scanning the room for anything out of place. The flickering sconces cast their unreliable light, and the rows of shelves stood as they always did, indifferent and unyielding. Yet, something felt different, though she couldn't put her finger on what. Emma set to work, forcing herself to focus on the task at hand. She began cataloging a section of ancient scrolls, their delicate parchment crumbling at the edges. The process required precision and care, and for a time, it distracted her from the unease gnawing at her. But the whispers returned. Faint at first, they grew steadily louder, weaving through the air like threads of sound. Emma froze, her hands hovering over a particularly fragile scroll, and strained to listen. The words were still unintelligible, but their tone had changed. Where before they seemed curious, almost questioning, now they carried a note of urgency, as though warning her of something unseen. She stood, her heart pounding, and followed the whispers. They seemed to emanate from the farthest corner of the archives, where the shadows were thickest and the light struggled to reach. Emma's footsteps were slow and deliberate, her senses on high alert. As she moved deeper into the room, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. She stopped in front of an old, ornate cabinet she hadn't noticed before. Its dark wood was intricately carved with the same spiraling patterns that adorned the walls, and its brass handles gleamed faintly in the dim light. The cabinet exuded an air of menace, as though it were alive and aware of her presence. Compelled by a mixture of curiosity and dread, Emma reached for the handles. They were cold to the touch, sending a shiver through her. With a deep breath, she pulled the cabinet doors open. Inside, nestled among stacks of ancient books and artifacts, was a small, iron key. The key was unlike anything she had seen before. Its surface was etched with runes that seemed to pulse faintly, as though imbued with a life of their own. The metal felt warm against her skin as she picked it up, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. The whispers surged, filling her mind with a cacophony of sound. Clutching the key tightly, Emma stumbled back from the cabinet, her vision blurring. For a moment, the room seemed to shift around her. The shelves stretched impossibly high, their tops disappearing into darkness, and the walls seemed to close in, the carvings writhing like living things. She closed her eyes, willing the sensation to pass, and when she opened them again, everything was as it had been. But the whispers had stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that pressed against her eardrums. Emma's breathing was ragged as she stared at the key in her hand. It felt heavier now, as though it carried a weight beyond its physical form. She slipped the key into her pocket and returned to her desk, her mind racing. What was the key for? Why had it been hidden away in the archives? And why did it feel as though it had been waiting for her? As she worked, the silence grew oppressive. The usual creaks and groans of the old building were absent, replaced by a stillness that seemed to swallow all sound. Emma found herself glancing over her shoulder repeatedly, the sensation of being watched stronger than ever. When her shift finally ended, she ascended the staircase with a sense of relief. Yet, as she stepped into the main library, she felt an inexplicable urge to look back. Standing at the bottom of the staircase, shrouded in shadow, was a figure. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared. The figure didn't move, didn't react to her presence. It was tall and indistinct, its form blurred as though it were part of the shadows themselves. She blinked, and it was gone, leaving her questioning whether it had been real or another trick of her mind. That night, the key rested beside the unmarked book on her bedside table, their presence a constant reminder of the secrets lurking within the archives. Emma lay awake, her thoughts consumed by the figure and the whispers, by the strange, heavy silence that had replaced them. Somewhere deep within the library, the key had unlocked more than she could comprehend. Chapter 4. The Tome That Should Not Exist. The following day arrived with an oppressive gloom that seemed to settle over the entire city. Thick clouds obscured the sun, and a chill wind whispered through the streets, carrying the promise of rain. Emma walked to the library with a sense of foreboding, her thoughts circling around the events of the previous day. The iron key weighed heavily in her pocket, its presence both a comfort and a curse. She had spent the night staring at it, tracing the etched runes with her fingertips and wondering about its purpose. It felt ancient, imbued with a purpose far beyond her understanding. The urge to return it to the cabinet warred with the compulsion to uncover its secrets. As she entered the library, she noticed a peculiar stillness in the air. The usual creaks of the old wooden beams and the faint rustle of unseen drafts were absent, replaced by a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Emma hesitated at the top of the staircase leading to the archives, her pulse quickening. The descent felt longer this time, each step echoing like a tolling bell. When she reached the bottom, the dim light of the sconces flickered weakly, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The air was colder than before, the chill seeping into her bones. Emma set her bag on the desk and retrieved the key from her pocket. The runes on its surface glimmered faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though reacting to the room's energy. She turned it over in her hand, trying to decipher its significance. Her gaze drifted to the ornate cabinet in the far corner, its presence a silent challenge. Before she could approach it, something else caught her attention. One of the carved walls near the back of the archives seemed different, its patterns more intricate and pronounced than the others. Emma felt drawn to it, her curiosity overriding her apprehension. She approached the wall slowly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust that coated the floor. As she neared, the carvings appeared to shift, their swirling patterns forming shapes that were almost recognizable but defied comprehension. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers grazing the cold stone. The moment she made contact, a low hum filled the air, resonating through the room. It wasn't loud, but it was deep and penetrating, vibrating in her chest like a second heartbeat. Emma pulled her hand back instinctively, but the hum persisted, growing in intensity. She stepped back, her eyes scanning the wall for any sign of what she had triggered. That was when she noticed it, a small keyhole embedded within the carvings, so well hidden that it was almost indistinguishable from the surrounding patterns. Her breath caught as realization dawned. The iron key felt impossibly heavy in her hand as she approached the wall again. Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears. She hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Whatever lay behind this wall, it was something meant to be hidden, something that perhaps should remain undisturbed. Despite her fear, she inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, the runes aligning with the edges of the keyhole. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like grinding stone, the wall began to shift. Emma stumbled back as the carvings parted, revealing a narrow passageway shrouded in darkness. A cold wind emanated from within, carrying with it a faint, acrid scent that made her stomach churn. The hum that had filled the air subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Summoning her courage, Emma stepped forward, the light from the sconces barely penetrating the gloom. She retrieved her flashlight from her bag and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. The passageway was lined with more carvings, their patterns more chaotic and unsettling than those in the main archives. The corridor sloped downward, leading deeper into the earth. Emma's footsteps echoed faintly as she descended, the air growing colder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around her, the carvings twisting and writhing in the flickering light of her flashlight. At the end of the passage, she found herself in a circular chamber. The ceiling was high, disappearing into darkness, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with books and artifacts. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface carved with the same swirling patterns that adorned the walls. On the pedestal lay an object shrouded in a dark cloth. Emma approached cautiously, her flashlight illuminating the surrounding area. The hum returned, faint but insistent, as though the room itself were alive. She reached out and removed the cloth, revealing a small, intricately carved box. The box was made of a dark, polished wood, its surface adorned with the same runes as the key. Emma felt a strange pull toward it, as though it were calling to her. Lifting the box carefully, she examined it under the beam of her flashlight. There was no visible opening, no latch or hinge, but it felt as though something inside it was shifting, moving against the confines of its wooden prison. The hum grew louder, resonating in her ears and chest. Before she could investigate further, the flashlight flickered, its beam weakening. Emma's pulse quickened as the shadows in the chamber seemed to deepen, encroaching on the small circle of light. The walls appeared to ripple, the carvings shifting and contorting into grotesque forms. A sudden noise broke the silence, a deep, resonant sound like a great bell tolling in the distance. Emma turned toward the passageway, her heart racing. The shadows along the corridor moved unnaturally, coalescing into shapes that defied explanation. Clutching the box tightly, she fled up the passageway, her flashlight flickering wildly. The shadows seemed to follow her, their presence pressing against her back like a physical force. By the time she reached the main archives, her breath was coming in ragged gasps. The chamber was silent once more, the only sound the pounding of her heart. Emma placed the box on the desk, her hands trembling. She stared at it, the weight of its secrets bearing down on her. Whatever she had found, it was something that should never have been uncovered. Yet, as she looked at the box, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't her who had found it, but that it had been waiting for her all along. Chapter 5. Ink-Stained Apparitions. The box sat on Emma's desk like a relic from another world, its dark wood gleaming faintly under the flickering light of the sconces. It seemed to pulse subtly, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. Emma couldn't tear her eyes away from it, her breath shallow and her mind spinning with questions. What was inside it? Why had it been hidden so deep within the library? And why did it feel as though it were watching her, waiting for her to act? The air in the archives felt heavier than usual, thick with an unseen presence that made her skin prickle. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum that emanated from the box. It wasn't a sound so much as a vibration, a resonance that seemed to echo in her very bones. Emma reached out, her fingers hovering just above the smooth surface of the box. The runes carved into it seemed to shift under her gaze, their patterns fluid and hypnotic. She could feel a pull, a strange compulsion to open it, even though no seam or latch was visible. Her hand trembled as she drew back, unwilling to disturb whatever lay within. Needing a distraction, she turned to the nearest shelf and began sorting through a stack of dusty ledgers. The routine work grounded her, giving her something to focus on other than the box and its mysterious allure. But as she worked, the hum grew louder, filling the room with a low, insistent vibration that made her teeth ache. Her gaze drifted back to the box, and she noticed something she hadn't before. A faint glow emanating from the runes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down her spine. The glow pulsed in time with the hum, as though the box were alive, responding to her presence. Emma backed away, her instinct screaming at her to leave the archives. But as she reached the staircase, she felt a strange resistance, as though an invisible barrier blocked her path. The air grew colder, and a creeping sense of dread enveloped her. She turned back toward the desk, her eyes fixed on the box. The shadows in the room began to shift, lengthening and deepening as the flickering light from the sconces struggled to hold them at bay. The carvings on the walls seemed to writhe, their patterns twisting into grotesque shapes that defied logic. Emma felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of being watched, though she was alone in the room. Her hand moved to her pocket, clutching the iron key. It was warm to the touch, its runes glowing faintly in the dim light. She realized with a sinking feeling that the key and the box were connected, two pieces of a puzzle she hadn't meant to solve. A sudden noise broke the silence, a low, guttural groan that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Emma froze, her pulse racing as the sound grew louder, reverberating through the room. The shadows coalesced, forming indistinct shapes that flickered at the edges of her vision. She couldn't tell if they were real or a product of her growing panic, but their presence was undeniable. As the groaning subsided, the hum from the box intensified, vibrating through the floor and into her body. Emma staggered back, her knees threatening to buckle under the weight of the sound. She clutched the edge of the desk for support, her eyes locked on the box. Then, without warning, the box began to open. It didn't open in the conventional sense. There were no hinges or lid to lift. Instead, the wood seemed to dissolve, peeling back layer by layer to reveal the object within. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she watched, unable to look away. Inside the box was a small, crystalline orb, its surface smooth and flawless. It glowed faintly with an otherworldly light, casting eerie patterns on the walls and ceiling. As Emma stared into its depths, she saw shapes moving within, indistinct figures that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke caught in a beam of light. The hum reached a crescendo, and the orb pulsed with a blinding flash of light. Emma shielded her eyes, her heart pounding as the room was plunged into darkness. When she opened her eyes again, the sconces had gone out, leaving only the faint glow of the orb to illuminate the room. The shadows were everywhere now, their shapes more defined and menacing. They circled her like predators, their movements slow and deliberate. Emma felt a cold sweat break out on her skin as the orb began to rise from the box, hovering in the air before her. It tilted slightly, as though regarding her, and the hum shifted into something that sounded almost like a voice. It wasn't a language she recognized, but the tone was clear, commanding, insistent, and ancient. The orb pulsed again, and the runes on the walls flared to life, their light burning away the shadows for a brief moment. Emma's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The orb, the key, the carvings, they were all connected, part of something far older and darker than she had imagined. She felt as though she had stumbled into the heart of a vast, incomprehensible machine, its gears turning around her with relentless purpose. The orb's light grew brighter, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming pressure. Emma sank to her knees, her vision swimming as the air seemed to grow thicker. The voice grew louder, its tone sharp and accusatory, as though chastising her for disturbing its slumber. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light dimmed, and the orb settled back into the box. The shadows receded, and the room was plunged into silence once more. Emma sat on the floor, trembling and gasping for breath, her mind reeling from the experience. The box was closed again, its surface smooth and unbroken as though nothing had happened. But Emma knew better. She had seen something she wasn't meant to see, touched something she wasn't meant to touch. The library was no longer just a place of books and history. It was a gateway to something far darker, and she had opened the door. As she staggered to her feet, Emma knew one thing for certain. The archives held more than secrets. They held a power that could not be contained, a force that was watching and waiting, and it had marked her as its own. Chapter 6. The Scribe's Curse. The following days were a blur of unease and sleepless nights for Emma. The events in the archives clung to her like a shadow, an ever-present reminder of the unknown forces she had disturbed. She could not forget the orb's otherworldly glow, the way the shadows seemed to come alive, or the oppressive hum that had resonated through her very being. Yet despite her fear, she felt an undeniable pull to return. The library's archives were no longer just a place of work. They had become a puzzle, a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be unraveled. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light seemed to whisper her name, beckoning her back into the depths. The box now sat locked in the far corner of her office, its presence a silent reminder of the unknown. Emma avoided looking at it, yet she couldn't bear to move it elsewhere. It was as though the box had claimed its place in her life, a sentinel guarding secrets she wasn't ready to face. As she entered the library that morning, a strange energy filled the air. The usual quiet felt charged, as though the building itself were alive and watching. Emma hesitated at the top of the stairs leading to the archives, her heart pounding as she descended into the gloom. The sconces flickered as she reached the bottom, their dim light casting shifting shadows across the walls. The room felt colder than usual, the chill seeping into her bones. Emma walked slowly to the central desk, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that seemed to accumulate no matter how often she cleaned. As she reached the desk, her eyes were drawn to a large tome that hadn't been there before. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, its surface etched with strange, faintly glowing symbols. The book radiated an unsettling aura, as though it were alive. Emma's fingers hovered over the cover, hesitant to touch it. She had learned to be cautious in the archives, where objects seemed to hold a life of their own. But her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She opened the book carefully, the pages releasing a faint, musty odor as they turned. The handwriting within was jagged and uneven, the ink faded but still legible. The text was in a language she didn't recognize, its symbols twisting and writhing on the page as though they resented being read. Emma's eyes scanned the pages, her mind struggling to make sense of the shapes and patterns. Then she saw it, a faint outline of the orb, sketched into the margins of one of the pages. The drawing was crude but unmistakable, its presence sending a jolt of recognition through her. Beneath the sketch were more symbols, their meaning elusive yet somehow familiar. As she studied the text, a strange sensation washed over her. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening around her. The air became heavy, pressing against her chest as though the very walls were closing in. Emma's head swam, her vision blurring as a faint whisper filled the room. At first, the sound was so soft she thought she was imagining it. But as she listened, the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was a chorus of voices, layered and overlapping, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The sound came from all around her, as though the very pages of the book were speaking. Emma slammed the book shut, her heart racing as the whispers abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, the absence of sound more unsettling than the voices had been. She stared at the closed book, her hands trembling. Her gaze shifted to the walls of the archives, where the carvings seemed to ripple and shift in the flickering light. The room felt alive, its presence oppressive and watchful. Emma felt as though she were an intruder, a trespasser in a place she had no right to be. Desperate for answers, she reopened the book and flipped through its pages. The text seemed to shift and change as she turned the pages, the symbols rearranging themselves into new patterns. It was as though the book were alive, responding to her presence. On one page, she found another sketch, this one of the carved walls in the archives. The drawing was detailed, capturing every swirl and curve of the patterns. Beneath it were more symbols, their meaning tantalizingly out of reach. Emma felt a strange connection to the image, as though the book were showing her something she needed to see. Then the whispers returned, louder and more distinct this time. Emma froze, her eyes scanning the room for the source of the sound. The shadows along the walls began to move, their shapes twisting into forms that defied explanation. The air grew colder, the chill biting into her skin. Emma clutched the book to her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She felt as though she were being watched, the unseen presence in the room growing stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, the carvings on the walls flared to life, their runes glowing with an intense, otherworldly light. The whispers became a deafening roar, the voices overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. Emma dropped the book, her hands flying to her ears as the sound overwhelmed her. The room seemed to ripple, the walls shifting and contorting as though the library itself were alive. Emma staggered backward, her vision swimming as the light from the carvings intensified. The shadows closed in around her, their forms towering and menacing. Just as the pressure became unbearable, the light abruptly faded, and the room was plunged into silence. Emma sank to the floor, gasping for breath as the whispers subsided. The book lay open on the floor, its pages blank and unmarked. She stared at it in disbelief, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The library was no longer just a place of knowledge and history. It was a living entity, a nexus of forces beyond her comprehension. As she picked up the book and placed it on the desk, Emma knew one thing for certain. The archives were not done with her. The secrets within their walls were ancient and powerful, and they had chosen her as their keeper or their pawn. Chapter 7. Whispers of a Forgotten Town. Emma didn't sleep that night. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her. The images of the glowing runes and the shifting shadows replaying in her mind like a fever dream. She sat in her small apartment, staring at the iron key she had placed on the coffee table. Its surface seemed dull now, its once luminous runes inert, as if the key itself was exhausted from its strange performance. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the key wasn't truly dormant. It felt like an object that waited, patient and unyielding, for its next moment of relevance. Even when she turned away, she could feel its presence, a magnetic pull that was impossible to ignore. Morning arrived, pale and gray, with a chill that seeped through the windows. Emma dressed mechanically, her thoughts still in the archives. She wasn't sure if she was ready to return, but staying away felt like surrendering to a fear that had already taken too much from her. Whatever mysteries the library held, she was determined to face them head-on. The library was quiet when she arrived, its grand halls bathed in the soft glow of the morning light filtering through stained glass windows. Emma made her way to the archives, her footsteps echoing faintly in the vast emptiness. The air grew colder as she descended the staircase, and she could feel the familiar weight of the room's presence pressing against her chest. The box was still in the corner of her office, untouched and unassuming, as though it hadn't been the source of so much terror. But it was the book on her desk that drew her attention. Its leather cover gleamed faintly in the dim light, and Emma noticed that the once blank pages were now filled with intricate, spidery handwriting. The script was in the same strange language she had seen before, but now it was interspersed with diagrams and symbols that seemed to pulse faintly as she looked at them. One page featured a detailed sketch of a figure, a tall, robed entity with a featureless face and elongated limbs. The figure stood amidst a swirl of runes, its posture rigid and imposing. Beneath the drawing was a single word, written in bold, jagged strokes: Sentinel. Emma's fingers brushed the edge of the page, and a sudden wave of nausea washed over her. She staggered back, clutching the edge of the desk for support. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier and more oppressive. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. Her head snapped toward the far wall, where the carvings seemed to ripple and shift, their patterns twisting into new forms. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed through the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Emma turned slowly, her heart pounding as the sound grew louder. It was deliberate, a measured beat that resonated in her chest. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, their edges sharpening into unnatural shapes. Then she saw it. Standing at the edge of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim light, was the figure from the book, the Sentinel. It was tall, impossibly so, its robed form blending into the darkness. Its face, or lack thereof, was a void, a blank expanse that seemed to swallow the light around it. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating force that made her knees buckle. The tapping sound continued, rhythmic and unrelenting, as though the figure's very existence generated the noise. The carvings on the walls flared to life, their runes glowing with an intense, cold light. The sentinel remained motionless, but Emma felt its attention shift toward her. It wasn't a physical gaze. There were no eyes to see, but she could feel its awareness, sharp and penetrating, as though it were peeling back the layers of her mind. Emma clutched the iron key in her pocket, its familiar weight grounding her against the suffocating presence of the figure. The key grew warm in her hand, its surface vibrating faintly. She didn't know why, but holding it made her feel slightly less vulnerable. as though it were a shield against the sentinel's oppressive energy. The room began to change. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, the carvings writhing like living things. The air was thick with the hum of the runes, their resonance vibrating through Emma's bones. She could feel the sentinel's presence growing stronger, its void-like face a fixed point in the swirling chaos. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It didn't walk so much as glide, its robed form flowing across the floor like liquid shadow. The tapping sound grew louder with each movement, a heartbeat of dread that echoed through the room. Emma's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. The sentinel stopped a few feet away, its towering form looming over her. The air around it seemed to distort, as though reality itself were bending under its weight. Emma gripped the iron key tighter, the runes on its surface flaring to life with a sudden, fiery glow. The sentinel's attention shifted to the key, its void-like face tilting slightly as though it were studying the object. The air around Emma grew colder, the shadows pressing in closer. For a brief moment, she felt as though she were standing on the edge of an abyss, the darkness threatening to pull her in. Then the sentinel raised an elongated hand, its movements slow and deliberate. The air crackled with energy as it pointed toward the book on the desk. The runes on the walls flared brighter, their light pulsing in time with the key's glow. Emma's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The sentinel wasn't attacking her. It was showing her something, directing her attention to the book. She took a hesitant step toward the desk, her hand trembling as she opened the book to the marked page. The diagrams and symbols seemed to leap off the page, their patterns shifting and rearranging themselves before her eyes. Emma felt a sudden clarity, as though a veil had been lifted from her mind. The sentinel's presence loomed behind her, silent and watchful, as she traced the lines of the diagrams with her finger. The key in her hand grew hotter, its glow intensifying as she followed the patterns. The room seemed to hum with anticipation, the air charged with an unseen force. Emma felt as though she were standing at the center of a vast, incomprehensible machine, its gears turning around her with relentless precision. As she reached the final symbol on the page, the key flared with a blinding light, and the sentinel vanished. The room fell silent, the carvings dimming to their usual, dormant state. Emma stood alone in the archives, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Chapter 8. Bound by Blood and Paper. The days that followed were laden with unease, as if the very air had thickened, holding its breath in anticipation of something. Emma could not shake the sensation that the library was no longer just a building, but a living entity, its walls pressing in closer each time she walked through its doors. The silence in the archives had grown heavier, more oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were watching her every move. Despite her growing anxiety, Emma found herself compelled to return to the library each day. There was a strange pull she couldn't resist, as though the archives were calling to her, drawing her deeper into their mysteries. The more she tried to distance herself, the more impossible it became to stay away. The unsettling presence of the sentinel, the whispers, and the key all seemed to be leading her down a path from which there was no turning back. On the 6th day after the incident with the sentinel, Emma arrived early in the morning, her footsteps slow and deliberate as she made her way down the winding hallways. The library was quieter than usual, the soft hum of the overhead lights the only sound breaking the silence. She entered the archives with trepidation, her eyes scanning the room, though she could already feel its weight pressing against her. The book with the sketches of the sentinel lay open on her desk, but it was the iron key that caught her eye. It sat in the middle of the desk, gleaming faintly in the dim light. The presence of the key was almost more disturbing now than it had been before. It seemed to pulse with energy, a silent, ominous force that tugged at her insides. Emma hesitated for a moment, but as usual, she could not ignore the pull. She took the key into her hand, its cool surface sending a shiver up her spine. For a long moment, she simply held it, as though seeking some kind of guidance from it. The key was a link to something beyond her comprehension, and yet she knew it was connected to everything that had happened since she first set foot in the archives. After a few minutes, Emma pushed the key back into her pocket and turned her attention to the locked door at the far end of the room. It had always been there, a heavy, wooden door with a tarnished brass handle. It was inconspicuous enough, but there was something about it. Something in the way it seemed to resist her gaze, as though it refused to acknowledge her presence. The door had been locked ever since she arrived at the library, but Emma had never given it much thought. There were countless rooms and corridors in the building, each with its own mysteries. She had assumed the door led to storage, or perhaps an old cellar, places of little interest. But recently, she had begun to wonder if there was more to it. The strange occurrences in the archives, the appearance of the sentinel, the whispers, the book, all seemed to point toward that door, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. And yet, the door remained stubbornly closed, its surface unmarred by time or wear. The lock on the handle was intricate, old-fashioned, and Emma couldn't help but notice, perfectly intact. She couldn't resist any longer. Emma crossed the room, her movements slow and deliberate, as if the very act of approaching the door could trigger some unknown consequence. As she stood in front of it, she ran her hand over the surface, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. There was no sign of age or decay, no hint that this door had been untouched for years. It was as though it had been waiting for her. The handle felt cold to the touch, its metal surface smooth and unyielding. Emma paused, her breath shallow, before she grasped the handle and twisted. It didn't budge. She twisted harder, applying more force, but the lock was unrelenting. The door wouldn't open. The silence in the room seemed to deepen, the air thickening around her as though the library itself were holding its breath. Emma stepped back, frustration bubbling inside her. She stared at the door, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossibility of it. Why wouldn't it open? And then she saw it. A small, faint crack had appeared in the wood just above the lock. It was barely noticeable, a thin line that ran vertically from top to bottom. But as Emma looked closer, she saw that it was pulsing, the crack expanding and contracting as though it were alive. The faintest sound of shifting would echo through the room, soft but unmistakable. Emma's heart raced as she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the crack. She reached out cautiously, her fingers trembling, and touched the wood. The moment her skin made contact, the crack widened, splintering the surface like a sudden gust of wind tearing through a fragile pane of glass. The sound of breaking would reverberated in the air, and Emma jerked her hand away in surprise. The door creaked, a low, grinding noise that seemed to echo through the room. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the door began to open. The space between the door and the frame grew wider, revealing nothing but blackness beyond it. Emma felt a chill wash over her as she peered into the darkness, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the void that frightened her. It was what was inside it. For the briefest moment, Emma could have sworn she saw movement in the dark, a flicker of something just beyond her reach. The shadows seemed to twist, undulating like smoke in the night air. Her pulse quickened as the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than ever. Without thinking, she stepped closer, drawn toward the unknown by the same force that had brought her to the archives. The air grew colder with each step, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble with each movement. The door creaked louder, its hinges protesting against whatever force was acting upon it. Emma placed her hand on the doorframe, her fingers brushing the cool wood as she prepared to cross the threshold. Her heart hammered in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. The door, now fully open, revealed a narrow passageway leading deeper into the library, further than Emma had ever ventured. The air beyond the door smelled musty, like old stone and decay. Emma hesitated, her mind filled with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. But something inside her, something primal and urgent, pushed her forward. She stepped into the passageway, the door groaning behind her as it swung closed with a final, unsettling thud. The darkness beyond was absolute. There were no lights, no sense of time or direction, only the oppressive weight of the silence surrounding her. Emma's breath was the only sound in the air, her steps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The walls seemed to close in around her as she moved forward, the narrow space growing tighter with every step. And then, she heard it. A low whisper, so faint she almost missed it. It came from deep within the passageway, rising up from the darkness. The sound was impossible to place, as though it were coming from all directions at once. Emma stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She was no longer alone. The air seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, thick with the weight of whatever ancient presence resided within the darkened hallways of the library. Emma felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as the whispers turned into a murmur, the voices growing clearer, more distinct. And in the silence that followed, Emma realized with a deep sense of dread that the voices were calling her name. Chapter 9. The Archivist's Oath. The air around Emma grew denser with every passing second, as though the very atmosphere were thickening, pulling her deeper into the library's unseen grip. The whispers that had once been faint were now unmistakable, rising in volume like a chorus of forgotten souls trapped in the walls. Each voice was distinct, yet they all seemed to blend together into one continuous hum, as if calling out from an untraceable depth. Emma stood motionless, her body frozen in place, every muscle tense, every sense heightened. She had been sure she was alone when she entered the passageway, but now it felt as though something, or someone, was right behind her, watching her, waiting. The sound of her heartbeat was deafening in her ears, drowning out everything else. The passage stretched on in front of her, an endless, winding corridor that seemed to disappear into the inky blackness. There were no windows, no lights, just the oppressive weight of the dark that seemed to close in with every step she took. She tried to move, to push forward, but her legs refused to cooperate. It felt as if the very floor beneath her was made of heavy, shifting sand, each step sinking her deeper into the unknown. The whispers swirled around her, now unmistakably close, and Emma could feel the breath of the unseen presence against the back of her neck. Without thinking, her hand shot out to grab the wall, her fingers brushing the cold, rough stone that lined the passage. She leaned against it for support, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but the air was no longer her own. It seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, thick with the weight of an ancient, malevolent force. A sudden draft swept through the corridor, sending a chill down her spine, and Emma's breath caught in her throat as a distinct, unmistakable sensation washed over her. A sense that something was moving, something was there with her, just out of sight. She turned her head instinctively, her eyes darting to every corner of the narrow passage, but there was nothing to see, only darkness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The murmur of the voices grew louder again, now all around her. Emma's pulse raced, her chest tight with fear. They were speaking, but not in words, at least, not in any language she recognized. The syllables were sharp, guttural, strange, like the scraping of something against stone, a language older than anything she could fathom. They echoed off the walls, vibrating in her very bones. She couldn't make sense of the whispers, couldn't understand what they wanted from her, but she felt them, felt their power, their pull. There was something behind her now, something that moved just out of her sight, something that had been with her from the moment she stepped through that door. It had been watching her, waiting for this moment. As the murmur continued, Emma began to notice a shift in the air. The temperature seemed to drop even further, the icy chill seeping into her bones. The smell of must and decay became overwhelming, suffocating her with its pungency. She tried to shake it off, but it clung to her, as though the very walls of the passage were alive, wrapping her in their cold, grasping embrace. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts now, her chest tight with fear. She felt as though she were suffocating, as though the air was being drawn out of her, leaving her gasping for breath. The whispers around her seemed to quicken, growing more frantic, their urgency palpable. Emma's fingers trembled as she pressed harder against the cold stone wall, desperately trying to ground herself in the midst of the overwhelming sensation that something was closing in on her. And then, she heard it. A distinct, sharp sound, footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming closer from behind her. Emma's heart skipped a beat, her entire body going rigid as the sound grew louder, closer, until it was almost deafening. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat, but there was nothing there. The passage remained empty, silent except for the whispers that still echoed around her. But the footsteps did not stop. They continued, now right behind her, so close she could feel the air shift with each step. Emma's pulse raced, panic flooding her veins as she took a step back, only to find herself stumbling against the cold stone. She pushed herself up again, her legs shaky beneath her as she scrambled for some semblance of control. The footsteps continued their rhythmic march, but when Emma looked around again, there was still no one in sight. It was as if the presence was toying with her, drawing closer and then retreating, playing a game she couldn't comprehend. Her mind raced with frantic thoughts. What was this thing? Was it a ghost, a shadow, or was it something more? Something ancient, something that had always been there, hiding just beneath the surface? The shadows themselves seemed to pulse, shifting and writhing in the corner of her vision. They were no longer static, no longer just an absence of light. They were moving, swirling in patterns that didn't make sense, their shapes distorting in impossible ways. Emma could feel the pull of them, a strange magnetic force that threatened to drag her deeper into their grasp. She turned back toward the direction she had been heading, her mind desperately trying to grasp at some semblance of logic. The passage seemed endless, but Emma couldn't be sure. Time felt distorted, like the walls themselves were stretching and contracting, distorting her perception. The whispers around her had now become a cacophony, a chorus of voices screaming in a language she couldn't comprehend, the sound deafening in her ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The footsteps, the whispers, the shifting shadows. For a moment, there was nothing but the cold silence of the passage, a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed down on her from all sides. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in place, unsure of whether to move forward or retreat. But before she could make a decision, a new sound reached her ears, a faint clicking noise like the turning of an old mechanism. She spun around again, her eyes frantically searching for the source of the sound. It was coming from further down the passage, where the darkness was thickest. It was a sound she knew. She had heard it before, but she couldn't place it. It was the sound of something being unlocked. The door at the end of the corridor, the one she hadn't noticed before, began to creak open, the metal mechanism turning with a slow, grinding groan. Emma felt a coldness wash over her, a wave of dread that threatened to overwhelm her. The door opened just enough for a sliver of light to escape, illuminating the darkness beyond in a sickly glow. The air seemed to tremble as the door opened wider, and Emma's feet moved of their own accord, carrying her toward it. She had to see what lay beyond, had to know. She couldn't help herself. Her curiosity was too powerful, too consuming. But as she stepped closer to the door, the whispering voices began again, louder this time, as though warning her, urging her to stop. But it was too late. She was already too close. The moment she stepped into the light, everything shifted. The world around her seemed to warp, reality bending in on itself. The door, the passage, the library, They were all part of something else now, something she couldn't understand, something she could never escape. Emma stepped forward, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Chapter 10. Pages of the Damned. Emma's eyes snapped open, but she saw nothing but the same dark void that had surrounded her moments before. She blinked, and the darkness seemed to shift, the contours of the space swirling like a whirlpool. It was as though the world had been swallowed whole, leaving her adrift in an empty sea of nothingness. There were no walls, no floor, no ceiling, just an endless expanse of blackness, stretching in all directions. Her senses felt heightened, sharper than they had ever been before. She could hear her own breath, shallow and ragged, filling the silence that pressed down on her from all sides. Her heart beat in her chest, each thrum a sharp reminder of the tension in the air, the oppressive weight that was slowly crushing her. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of lead. She couldn't bring herself to take a step. The moment she did, a wave of dizziness hit her, the floor beneath her seeming to tilt and buckle. She swayed on unsteady feet, her vision swimming as she tried to focus on the nothingness around her. But then, just as the dizziness threatened to overwhelm her, the ground beneath her feet shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a slight tremor in the very air around her. And then, a faint sound emerged, like the scraping of stone on stone. The ground cracked open beneath her, a jagged fissure splitting the endless void, revealing a yawning chasm below. Emma gasped, her body jerking back instinctively as the abyss seemed to call to her, pulling at her very soul. The chasm stretched deep into the earth, an unfathomable darkness swallowing everything in its path. There was no bottom, no end, just the vast, hungry emptiness that reached into the very core of the world. The sound of the chasm seemed to echo in her bones, reverberating through her body like a low, mournful hum. It was almost as if the chasm itself were alive, pulsing with a strange, sentient energy that pressed against her mind. She felt its pull, its desire to claim her, to drag her into its depths. With a sharp intake of breath, she stepped back again, her heart racing as she tried to steady herself. The chasm loomed before her, a terrifying, endless void, its presence overwhelming her senses. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to escape, but she couldn't. Her legs wouldn't move, her body frozen in place. The pull of the chasm was too strong, too compelling. And then, she heard it. A voice, a whisper, low and almost imperceptible, coming from the depths of the chasm. Emma's pulse quickened as she strained to listen, trying to catch the words, but they were lost in the wind, carried away by the abyss. The sound was like a faint cry, distant but undeniable, a cry that seemed to reverberate in the pit of her stomach. It was a voice she didn't recognize, but it sounded like it was calling to her, beckoning her closer to the edge. The shadows around her shifted once again, swirling like a living thing. The whispers that had been constant now grew louder, more insistent, until they became a cacophony of voices, each one louder than the last. Emma could feel them, could hear them, surrounding her like a storm. The pressure in the air increased, her breath becoming more difficult to draw in as the dark energy intensified. She reached out, her hand trembling as she hovered over the edge of the chasm, her fingertips brushing the air just above it. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever felt. It was as if the very air itself was charged with an unnatural energy, a force that pushed and pulled at her all at once. Suddenly, a gust of wind whipped through the darkness, howling like a beast. The chasm seemed to grow wider, deeper, as if it were opening its mouth to swallow the world whole. Emma stumbled back, her feet unsteady, her heart thundering in her chest. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the abyss. It was like a magnet, pulling her in, demanding her attention. In a moment of panic, she turned away, desperate to escape the overwhelming sensation of being drawn into the chasm. Her body lurched forward, but the ground beneath her shifted again, tilting wildly as the walls of the darkness seemed to close in on her. She was no longer standing on solid ground. She was falling. Her stomach lurched as she tumbled through the air, her body spinning out of control. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The darkness swallowed her whole, consuming her entirely. For what felt like an eternity, there was only the sensation of falling, of weightlessness, of being untethered from reality itself. The whispers had grown into a roar, a deafening cacophony that filled her mind, drowning out everything else. The very air around her seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, pressing down on her from all sides. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. Emma's body hit the ground with a jarring thud, the impact forcing the breath from her lungs. She lay there, gasping, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to regain some semblance of control. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her arms trembling as she sought to steady herself. She looked around, but all she could see was darkness. There was no sign of the chasm, no hint of the abyss that had swallowed her just moments before. The air was thick, oppressive, but there was a strange stillness now, an eerie calm that settled over her like a blanket. She was no longer in the same place she had been. The ground beneath her was cold and uneven, the surface rough like stone, yet there were no walls, no structure to her surroundings. She was in some sort of vast, open space, one that stretched endlessly in every direction. The weight of the silence was unbearable, suffocating her with its intensity. And yet, in the distance, she could see it. A faint, flickering light. It was small, but unmistakable, a pale, flickering glow that seemed to beckon to her. It was so far away, but Emma could feel it pulling at her, urging her to move toward it. Her feet moved of their own accord, her body seemingly drawn toward the light as though it held some secret, some promise of escape. She didn't question it. She had no choice. With each step, the light grew brighter, its glow intensifying, until it consumed everything around her. The darkness receded, fading into nothingness, until all that was left was the flickering light. And as Emma stepped into its warmth, she could feel it, the presence. It was there, just behind her, just beyond her reach. She turned her head instinctively, but the light was the only thing she could see. The presence was gone, for now, and as the light enveloped her, Emma knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Chapter 11. The Book of No Return. The light had consumed Emma, its warmth washing over her skin like a balm, soothing the tension that had gripped her for so long. But as the warmth lingered, she soon realized it was not enough to silence the growing unease that had settled deep within her. The silence was too profound, too absolute, leaving her mind to wander with nothing but the strange pull of the light guiding her forward. She moved forward, her legs still unsteady but compelled by something unseen, something deep within the core of the light. She tried to focus on the glow, but as she moved further, the light began to stretch, unraveling and distorting, as though it were warping around her. The edges of the world blurred into shadow. At first, she thought it was merely her perception playing tricks on her, the lingering effects of the chasm still clouding her senses. But as the shadows grew longer, darker, and more tangible, Emma realized that something was wrong. The once comforting glow of the light flickered, then sputtered, like a dying candle. Her breath quickened, her pulse hammering in her throat as the shadows deepened around her. The oppressive weight of the silence pressed harder on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. The shadows, once simply things of darkness, now had shape, unnatural shapes, bending and shifting just at the edge of her vision. They seemed to move with purpose, creeping and crawling toward her, their forms indistinct but undeniably malicious. Her footsteps faltered. She wanted to look away, to flee, but something inside her told her to stay, to keep moving forward. She clenched her fists, trying to hold herself together, but the fear was growing, slipping through the cracks in her resolve. She quickened her pace, but no matter how fast she moved, the shadows seemed to close in on her, inch by inch, until they swallowed everything else. She stopped, her heart racing as she realized that the light was gone. There was no more warmth, no more comfort. All that remained was the darkness. It was no longer a void, but an oppressive, living thing, writhing and twisting, surrounding her, suffocating her with its presence. She spun around, looking for something, anything that could give her direction, but there was nothing. The ground beneath her was no longer solid. The sense of falling returned, though she was no longer in free fall. Her body felt light, as if she were hovering, suspended in the air. She reached out, searching for something to ground her, but her fingers brushed against nothing but the chill of the surrounding blackness. The air grew thick with whispers, faint and barely audible at first, but as they gathered strength, they became louder, sharper. They spoke in tongues she didn't understand, hissing, rasping, as though the shadows themselves were speaking to her. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and though she tried to scream, no sound escaped her lips. The whispers grew more insistent, the words fraying at the edges of her sanity. Suddenly, from the heart of the darkness, something stirred. A figure, a silhouette, emerged from the swirling shadows. It was humanoid in shape, but its outline was jagged, malformed, like something that did not belong in this world. It loomed in the distance, its presence radiating an overwhelming sense of malice. Emma's heart stopped, her legs frozen in place, as though her body had been paralyzed by the sheer force of the figure's malevolent energy. The whispers grew louder, now clear as they circled her like vultures. The figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, each step slow and deliberate, as though it were toying with her, savoring her fear. Emma's body tensed, every muscle coiled, ready to flee, but still, she could not move. As the figure came into focus, its shape solidified into something more horrifying than she could have imagined. It was a shadow made flesh, dark, shifting, with a face she could not fully see. Its features flickered like a flame, vanishing and reappearing as though they were too dangerous to hold in place. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, sickly light, a cold blue that radiated no warmth, only a deep, unnatural emptiness. Emma felt herself recoil, her skin crawling as the figure stepped closer, and yet, still, she could not move. The figure reached out, its hand long and clawed, stretching toward her, and though it was distant, it felt as though the hand was inches from her face. The whispering grew louder, and with each passing moment, the words became clearer, as though the shadows were speaking directly to her. They were calling her name. Not Emma, not the name she had once known. It was something else. A name she didn't recognize but knew intimately. Something that had been buried deep within her, forgotten. It was an echo of a life that she couldn't remember, a life that no longer made sense. The figure's mouth opened, a jagged, toothless grin spreading across its face. The whispers coalesced, their voices intertwining into a single, unmistakable command. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice a distorted echo that reverberated in her skull. "Come and know your true self." Emma's breath caught in her throat, a cold, icy fear gripping her chest. She fought the instinct to run, to scream, but the force of the figure's presence rooted her in place, unable to do anything but wait as the shadows stretched out toward her like hands reaching from the deep. The figure's grin widened, and in that moment, Emma realized something terrifying. She had been here before. This place, this dark realm, this suffocating void, it was familiar, as though she had come to this very point once before and had not escaped. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was trapped. The shadows were not just an enemy to be outrun. They were a part of her. They had always been there. With no other choice, she took a trembling step forward. The figure's eyes flared brighter, its grin widening impossibly, and the shadows behind it swirled violently. As Emma took another step, the air around her grew even colder, and the shadows stretched toward her, beckoning her closer. It was then that she understood. The darkness was not just a place she had fallen into. It was a reflection of her own soul, a fractured, twisted piece of herself that she had been avoiding. The whispers were not otherworldly voices, but her own, a broken echo from within, urging her to confront the things she had denied for so long. And as the figure closed in on her, Emma knew that the real battle was not one against the darkness surrounding her, but against the darkness within her. She could feel it, the call to surrender, to become one with the shadows. But she hesitated. In that moment of stillness, everything seemed to freeze. Her body, her thoughts, the oppressive presence around her. The whispers stopped. The figure's glowing eyes dimmed, its outstretched hand frozen in midair. The silence was deafening, and Emma realized that the choice was hers. Chapter 12. The Keeper's Last Secret. Time had lost all meaning. The world beyond the shadows, the one she had known before, seemed distant now, as if it had belonged to someone else, a version of her that no longer existed. Emma stood frozen, her body caught between two worlds, one where the light had once touched her, and one where the darkness held dominion over her very soul. The figure before her lingered, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, its form rippling like liquid shadows. It beckoned her closer with an almost imperceptible movement of its outstretched hand, the air between them thickening with an unspeakable force. The silence around her was so absolute that she could hear the faintest tremors in her own heartbeat. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with the weight of an ancient fear she could not place, but recognized instinctively. She could feel the tendrils of the darkness reaching out for her, not physically, but inside her, pulling her apart from the inside out, testing her resolve. And yet, despite the terror clawing at her, something within Emma stirred. A flicker of defiance, small, fragile, but unmistakable. It was the last remnant of the light that had once guided her, the whisper of a memory buried deep within her mind. She had faced worse, hadn't she? Hadn't she already walked through the very heart of the unknown? The whispers had stopped. For a moment, the dark realm was still. The figure before her was suspended in the eerie quiet, its dark gaze never leaving her face. The shadows, once menacing and violent, seemed to draw back, as though waiting for her next move. They were no longer the hungry entities that sought to consume her. They were a reflection, an extension of her own fear, her own guilt. She realized now that the shadows had not simply arrived to destroy her. They had always been there, in the corners of her mind, in the depths of her memories. They were a part of her, born of the choices she had made, of the things she had hidden from herself. The figure, still watching her, seemed to grow larger, the darkness around it warping and shifting, becoming more defined, more tangible. The air itself seemed to ripple as the figure's form seemed to dissolve into the very shadows, a cloud of darkness that hovered just on the edge of her awareness. It was no longer a physical being. It was a presence, a weight in the very space around her, a reminder of everything she had ever tried to forget. But Emma was no longer afraid. She wasn't sure how it had happened, But with the awareness came an unshakable calm. She had walked into this place willingly, hadn't she? Hadn't she longed for the answers, even if they came in the form of nightmares? She had sought the truth in every shadow, every flicker of the unknown, and now it was here, standing before her. The figure remained silent, its expression unreadable, its movement still. And then, something changed in the atmosphere. A slight shift, imperceptible at first, but undeniable. The shadows around her pulsed, a rhythmic beat in the otherwise still air, as though they were alive, responding to her very thoughts. Emma realized, in that fleeting moment, that the figure wasn't just waiting for her to approach. It was waiting for her to understand, to comprehend what she had become and what she had left behind. She could feel it now, the weight of her own decisions, the culmination of her journey. She had been running, hadn't she? Running from something, running towards something, always seeking to fill the empty spaces within her. But the emptiness was not something she could escape. It was something she had created, something that had always been a part of her, hidden away beneath layers of denial and fear. And now, here, in the midst of the consuming darkness, Emma understood. The shadows were not her enemy. They were not something to be destroyed. They were a part of her, fragile, broken, but undeniably real. She had hidden from them for so long. But now, in this moment, she had the chance to face them. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching out, her fingers trembling as they neared the dark form. The figure watched, its hollow eyes unblinking, as though it were waiting for her to make the final decision. And Emma, with the remnants of her courage, reached into the darkness. The moment her fingers brushed against the shadowy form, the world around her seemed to explode. The air cracked with an otherworldly sound, a sudden rush of energy that surged through her veins, flooding her senses. She could feel the darkness, the shadows, surging into her with a violent force. They were no longer distant, no longer foreign. They were inside her, consuming her, filling every corner of her mind, her heart, her very soul. For a split second, she feared she would lose herself, that she would be swallowed whole by the darkness. But instead of drowning, she embraced it. She welcomed the shadows that had once terrified her, the void that had always whispered her name. They were not her enemy. They were her truth, her reality. And as the figure disintegrated into the darkness around her, Emma stood in the heart of the storm, her breath slow and steady, the shadows swirling in the space around her, no longer a threat, but a part of her, a part she had come to accept. The world seemed to shift. The oppressive weight of the darkness began to lift, slowly, as though the very act of embracing the shadows had caused them to lose their power over her. The air lightened. The pulse of the shadows diminished. And yet, Emma knew that she had not won, nor had she lost. There was no victory here. There was only acceptance. She looked around her, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she saw something beyond the shadows. A glimmer of light. Faint, but unmistakable. It was distant, far off, and yet it was there. She didn't know where it led, nor did she care. The journey ahead was unclear, but for the first time, Emma understood that the light was not something to be sought. It was something that lived within her, alongside the darkness. And so, with no more fear, she turned toward the light. Chapter 13. The final chapter writes itself. Emma had long since lost track of time. The light before her was not as she had expected, brilliant and sharp like a star or the midday sun. It was soft, warm, a golden hue that seemed to pulse with a rhythm all its own, much like a heartbeat. The further she moved toward it, the less it seemed to belong to the world she had once known. Instead, it wrapped around her, like an old, familiar melody that echoed somewhere deep within her. A sensation so profound, It felt almost like a memory, like a place she had been before but had forgotten until now. She didn't know how long she had been walking, nor where she was walking to. The landscape around her had shifted so gradually that she had not realized the change. The heavy, suffocating darkness had ebbed away, but it was not replaced by the bright, overpowering light she had anticipated. The world before her had become muted, bathed in a gentle twilight that seemed to hover between dusk and dawn. The shadows, those creatures of the night that had once threatened to swallow her whole, had become soft and distant, almost tender, as if they were no longer her enemy but something she had learned to coexist with. It was a strange, surreal calm that filled her now. She could feel the remnants of fear still clinging to her, buried beneath layers of acceptance. She was no longer running, no longer seeking to escape something that had been chasing her for so long. She had stopped running a long time ago. What had driven her to that point of relentless flight, she could not recall. All that remained now was this: the quiet, the soft twilight, the gentle pulse of the light, and the deep, aching awareness of everything she had become. As she walked, the scenery shifted around her. The golden light grew stronger, yet it did not burn. It embraced her. The ground beneath her feet, once jagged and uncertain, had become smooth and solid, like the earth had healed itself from the scars of old wounds. The air, once thick with the weight of shadow, was now crisp and fragrant, as though the very world around her had been cleansed. And yet, even as she felt the softness of this place, a persistent whisper tugged at her mind, the feeling that she was not truly alone. It was not the presence of the figure, nor the shadows, nor any of the other things that had plagued her in the dark depths of her journey. No, this was different. This whisper did not come from an external source. It was not spoken, but felt. The quiet hum of something larger than her, something vast and incomprehensible, like the endless universe itself, shifting and changing with each passing second. The path she walked on had no clear destination. There were no markers, no boundaries. There were no edges to the world that she had entered, no horizon to speak of. It was as if the world itself was both infinite and contained within the space she occupied. And yet, in that boundless stretch of timelessness, she could not shake the feeling that she had arrived somewhere, that this place was not entirely unknown to her. She had been here before. Not in this exact form, perhaps, but this place, the feeling, the atmosphere, had a profound familiarity to it. She had walked these same steps once, long ago, or perhaps not at all. The ambiguity of it gnawed at her. It was not a place of beginnings, nor was it an end. It was something in between, something eternal, suspended outside of the limits of time. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but there was nothing. No people, no creatures, no other souls to greet her in this strange space. It was only her, moving in the quiet, her footsteps soundless upon the soft ground. The feeling of solitude was not one of loneliness, though. It was a solitude born from knowing that she was not apart from the world, but a part of it, as if this was where she had always belonged, a place she had returned to after a long and tiresome journey. The light continued to pulse, its warmth still surrounding her like an embrace. But it was not a light that spoke of safety. It was a light that carried weight. It was not the absence of darkness, but the coexistence of light and shadow. A harmony, a balance. For the first time since her journey had begun, Emma was at peace. She had faced the shadows that had haunted her, not by running from them, but by walking with them, by acknowledging their place in her life. She had once thought they were enemies, but now she understood. They were part of her story, part of who she had become. The darkness had not consumed her. It had shaped her, and in that shape, there was strength. But even in the silence, something else beckoned her forward. Not in urgency, not in fear, but with an almost imperceptible pull. It was as if something unseen, something beyond her comprehension, was calling her to continue. The path was endless, and so, too, was the journey. The light before her no longer seemed to define a beginning or an end. It simply was. It was everything and nothing, and it had always been. Emma did not stop. There was no reason to. There was no destination, no goal to reach. She moved through this quiet, timeless place as one would wander through a dream, accepting the absence of time and the weight of eternity. There was no turning back now, no returning to the life she had once known, because she realized that there had never been a life before this place. This place was where she had always belonged, and in that realization, she understood the final truth. She was not alone, nor had she ever been. The light, the shadows, the silence, and the whispers, they were all part of her, and as she walked, one step after the next, she knew that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something far beyond her understanding, a journey without a clear path, but one that would never stop. It was the eternal return.